Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Dan cannot be here tonight, but we have a video from him, so we are going to start with a video from our HGC board president, Dan Allen.
Good evening. This is Dan Allen. I'm president of HGC, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody this evening to a portion of our Grassroots virtual awards presentation in this, our 50th year. HGC is the citywide advocate for the city's historic districts, and we're thrilled tonight to honor Nathan Kensinger and Peter Bray as the recipient of our Mickey Murphy Award. I'm going to let Simeon Bankoff take care of the details and give you a better introduction to these two remarkable people. But I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and hope everyone enjoys the evening, and hope that we can repeat this as a real party someday. We can all see each other again. Thanks very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Simeon Bankoff.
Hello, and welcome to the Grassroots Preservation Awards of the Historic Districts Council 2020, Take 2. I'm sorry everyone won't be here tonight, though this will be preserved forever on YouTube, so that really will be something. It's our complete pleasure to honor these two wonderful people for Grassroots. Grassroots is an incredibly important program for the Historic Districts Council. It's when we have a chance to really celebrate the people who are doing the work, who are who are doing the work, who are educating the public, who are uplifting all of us through their tireless devotion and just really going out there and working for the communities that we base all of our time doing and forwarding our mission on. This year we're breaking it up into a couple of different parts, just because, as you can tell, we're really Zoom experts now, so we thought that keeping a sort of shortened Zoom moment would be good. And the next one is going to be on July 8th. Please RSVP on our website, hdc.org. It is my complete pleasure to introduce these two of our honorees tonight. We've got Nathan Kinzinger, who is our friend from the Fourth Estate, our friend from the media. And that's a really important role, because if you do something in advocacy, you really need people to notice. And public awareness and media is an incredibly important way of recruiting people to your side, of getting the word out. Otherwise, we're just talking to each other, which is what we do anyway, but there are only so many phone calls you can make during a day. And having friends and having colleagues and having advocates who are out there creating content, or whatever the official 2020 buzzword for media is a key role in any public campaign. And Nathan has done a remarkable job for a really long time on this. He is a photographer, a filmmaker, a journalist, and a curator who's been documenting some of New York City's abandoned edges, endangered neighborhoods, and post-industrial waterfronts for more than a decade. His most recent film, Managed Retreat, really addresses what is going on in some of those neighborhoods that you only see through fences and behind chicken wire, that as the water slowly rises, and we all are going to have to learn how to take very deep breaths or figure out some way around it. His long-running camera obscura photo essays, which are beautiful and eruditely written, appeared on the Curbed website from 2012 until very recently, and they are permanently archived. They are, and on Nathan's website, they are in some cases primary source materials for neighborhoods you've never heard of and you would love to know more about. And they really have opened up hidden corners of New York to tens of thousands of readers. Nathan is currently a contributing writer on Gothamist, and is continuing to push an awareness of our sort of post-industrial world to everyone. He's also the only person I've met who ever had a art exhibition on longtime display in the Atlantic Avenue subway terminal. which was quite remarkable. Next up is Peter Bray, who will be receiving our Mickey Murphy Award for honoring longtime record of achievement in historic preservation. It is remarkably appropriate that Peter should be getting the Mickey Murphy Award, because Mickey, for those of you who may didn't have the pleasure of knowing her, was a 50-year advocate for the Brooklyn waterfront. She was by trade a newspaper person, a journalist. She wrote The Treasury of Brooklyn History back in 1953, which was a sort of seminal work, and worked tirelessly for the protection of areas such as Vinegar Hill, Dumbo, and the Brooklyn waterfront, as well as the South Street Seaport. She also was a member of the Board of Governors of the Brooklyn Heights Association, which Peter, now let's talk about Peter. Peter had served, most recently has served as the executive director of the Brooklyn Heights Association during a pivotal time during the neighborhood's campaign to preserve the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, and also to temper development in Brooklyn Bridge Park. The Brooklyn Bridge Park is a complex issue. It's brought many good things, but it also has brought unforeseen, or perhaps foreseen but ignored, pressures on the area. Peter, not restraining himself simply to Brooklyn Heights, Peter has been a strong advocate for historic preservation throughout Brooklyn and New York City. He's involved in the Gowanus Landmarking Coalition with the Historic Districts Council, which helped spearhead the designation of 5 individual properties prior to the rezoning, which is a remarkable thing that we pushed real hard for. And Peter was people who wouldn't want to listen to us, but would listen to Peter. He's also been extraordinarily active in his own neighborhood of Park Slope, helping lead the first 2 expansions of the Park Slope Historic District since its original designation in 1973, and making, by some counts, the parks, which has made the Park Slope Historic Districts, by some counts, the largest historic district in New York City, or close therein. There's this, even though landmarking is about property, there's always this weird fudge factor depending on how you count it. Prior to his time as executive director of the Brooklyn Heights Association, Peter was involved in revitalizing communities in the South Bronx and founded and directed the New York Network Action Consortium, which was designed to strengthen the growth of affordable financial services to low-income communities and to increase opportunities for low-income families to save money, build financial skills, and start businesses, which is something very much, I think, on people's minds now as we're dealing with the economic ramifications of this peculiar time we're living in. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to turn it over to Nathan. We will be returning. There is some time at the end of this presentation for Q&A. Throw things into the chat, and thank you all so much for joining us. Nathan.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? I guess, can you hear me, Peter? I guess my audio is good. Excellent. Yeah, so thank you everyone so much for being here today, and thank you, Simeon, for the great introduction. Simeon, I've always appreciated how eloquent you are when talking about the importance of historic preservation, which is one reason why I've enjoyed interviewing you for so many articles over the years. I'm truly honored to be receiving this award today from the Historic Districts Council. I've been writing about historic preservation issues in New York City for the last 15 years, and I've been consistently impressed with the work being done by the HDC to advance the cause of preservation citywide. There's not a lot of awards for the kind of work that I do, and this is actually the first award that I've received for my work as a journalist in New York City. So receiving this recognition from my organization that I hold in such high regard is really just a great honor. Thank you so much for that. I guess in accepting this award, the HDC has asked me to talk for a little bit about how my career as a photojournalist has led me to become a preservationist, and how I've helped to document New York City's history. There's definitely a lot that I could say about that, but I'll try to keep it short and interesting. They've asked me to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll keep it relatively brief. For those who are not familiar with my work, I'll say that I specialize in documenting the lesser known parts of New York City. And for the last 15 years, I've been creating a series of photo essays, films, exhibits, and public art installations dedicated to sharing the stories of New York City's changing landscapes. The pieces look at industrial neighborhoods and abandoned landmarks and disappearing mom and pop businesses and climate change and forgotten natural areas. And one of the biggest parts of that project for the last 15 years has been a series of photo essays that I started back in 2007. I've now written a new photo essay about New York City almost every 2 weeks for the last 14 years. And there are now more than 260 of these photo essays online. The archive of photo essays documents a period of pretty radical change in New York City, as thousands of older businesses and buildings and neighborhood landmarks have been demolished to make way for new development and new glass towers around the entire city. And for the last 8 years, these photo essays were published at Curbed New York as a column called Camera Obscura. So I have to definitely thank all of the editors that I've collaborated with at Curbed over the years, including Robert Gooskind and Joey Iraq and Kelsey Keith and Sarah Polsky and Hannah Alberts, and especially Amy Plitt, who has been editing my work for the last 5 years. I'm going to share my screen now to show some examples from my photo essays. Let me see if I can get this to work. Let's see. Oh. Is this showing up as a full screen for people? Great, excellent. Oops, go back one there. So I first began documenting New York City in 2003 when I moved to Brooklyn. And I moved just a few blocks away from the Gowanus Canal. And I came to New York with really the specific goal of getting to know as much of the city as possible. I immediately started exploring the neighborhoods and buildings that were around me, including the waterfront of the Gowanus and Red Hook. And at the time, the waterfront of Brooklyn was a really different place. This is only, like 17 years ago, but it was a very different place where you could go wander freely through abandoned sugar refineries and powerhouses and empty lots. And it was really fascinating to be able to go inside these buildings and experience their history in person. My earliest photo essays were mostly focused on the industrial waterfront of Brooklyn. And in each piece, I would photograph and write a portrait of a historic building, including places like the Revere Sugar Refinery and the Todd Shipyards in Red Hook, and the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Powerhouse on the Gowanus, and this is the Kanye Stone building on the Gowanus that we're looking at. Also the Domino Sugar Refinery and the Kent Avenue Powerhouse in Williamsburg. And as I continued to write these pieces, I started exploring abandoned buildings in all 5 boroughs. And the work really began to be kind of a race against the wrecking ball, with many of the industrial buildings demolished shortly after I visited them and documented them to make way for new towers along the water. And so my work became even more urgent as I continued to write about and photograph the city. As I started to branch out and explore all 5 boroughs, I began expanding the essays to look at not just buildings, but entire neighborhoods that were facing demolition, including portraits of places like Manhattanville, which was largely demolished by Columbia University. And in this piece here, the Brighton Beach bungalows, many of which were destroyed when the neighborhood was rezoned by the city. The early photo essays were all self-published, with the idea that they would be picked up by larger organizations like Gothamist or Curbed or the New York Times. This is a fun piece the New York Times did featuring some of my photographs called Have Camera Will Trespass on the Brooklyn waterfront. And I'm happy to say that the photo essays have gone on to reach an audience of millions of readers online over the years, and in newspapers as well, which I hope has helped to change the dialogue around industrial architecture in New York City and vernacular architecture, and also the importance of neighborhood landmarks. Um, so yeah, unfortunately, most of the places that I documented in these early years have since disappeared, and the photos have become part of almost a history of images of a vanished New York City. In the last 20 years, we've seen an unprecedented amount of change in New York, most of which was set in motion by former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, one of the richest men in the world. And under his administration, approximately 40% of New York City was rezoned, allowing for the demolition of really countless historic buildings and businesses. And this unchecked redevelopment of the city's landscape has largely continued, I would say, under Mayor de Blasio. My work at Curbed has continued to document these losses, including articles about places like Admiral's Row, a collection of historic residences at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which were demolished in 2016 to make way for a grocery store parking lot, and neighborhoods like Willets Point, which is also known as the Iron, which is now, after decades of city neglect, again, to make way for some kind of billion or multi-billion-dollar development project. I take a pretty expansive view, I would say, of what historic preservation includes or can include. And I would say that a lot of the other places that I've documented in the city also fit under the umbrella of preservation. One series that I've been working on since 2014 is about the efforts to preserve and protect all of the above ground rivers and streams in New York City. And some highlights from that series include historic places like Lemon Creek in Staten Island and Hook Creek in Queens. Many of these rivers and creeks have somehow survived intact for hundreds of years, but are also now threatened by development in a lot of cases. I've also continued at Curb to document endangered vernacular architecture around the city, including visiting all of the horse stables that are left in New York, and pieces about the historic bungalow colonies that are remaining in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. And also this piece was a highlight for me, looking at the story of the Casitas of the South Bronx, which are these beautiful one-room clubhouses that are built inside many of the community gardens in the neighborhoods there. And they date back to the 1970s. I feel like there's just so many interesting structures in New York that were not necessarily designed by a famous architect, but that are still worthy of preservation because they're such an important part of the historic fabric of the city and the cultural fabric of the city. This is a portrait of me in one of my favorite old buildings. I would say that creating these photo essays has definitely not been easy. It often involves hopping fences or running away from guard dogs or hiking around in some of the most toxic landscapes in New York City. And I've collaborated with a lot of other artists and photographers along the way, but I especially need to thank my good friend Nate Dorr, who took this photograph and who's collaborated with me on documenting so many of these important places. The reward in doing this work is really seeing parts of the city that few other people will ever have a chance to, and sharing that with a wider audience. In terms of how I came to be involved in this kind of hands-on approach to historic preservation, I really have to thank my parents, Carrie and Kathy Kensinger, who I think are with us tonight. The roots of all of my work really came from them and from my childhood in San Francisco, where I grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s. And even though San Francisco is a relatively young city, it still was a great place to gain an early appreciation for older architecture and neighborhoods and businesses. In the 1970s, my father started one of the first businesses to restore and repaint old Victorian houses in San Francisco, the Painted Ladies of San Francisco. And we still see examples of his handiwork when we drive around the city that have survived for decades. And one of my mother's passions was for photographing the old back roads around our neighborhood, like the one that you see in this photograph here. My childhood bedroom is now filled with her photographs of San Francisco's old buildings and lanes, which were always a great inspiration to me as a photographer and a documentarian. As a kid, one of the first preservation projects that I was involved in with my family was helping to restore the buildings and grounds of the first Unitarian Church of San Francisco, which was a beautiful structure dating back to 1889. We chopped down the ivy that was damaging its tower, and we visited the stained glass workshops to look at colors. And it really gave me an appreciation for kind of the hands-on aspects of historic preservation, like really getting out there in the field and literally getting dirty. This is a picture of me with wielding an axe at the Unitarian Church. The axe looks like it's bigger than me, actually. The roots of my journalism also trace back to San Francisco. I started my career as a journalist in San Francisco at my high school paper, The Lowell, and then I worked at the San Francisco Chronicle for 4 years during college. And some of my earliest articles were about issues of neighborhood preservation. Including this piece here. This was written for the Bernal Journal, my local paper in Bernal Heights in 1997, and was about the last dirt roads in my community being paved over for development, which really destroyed the soul of that community. And I feel like that's a story that I have gone on to write over and over again here in New York City. So that's a little backstory of how I came to be a photojournalist, writing about neighborhoods and about historic preservation. I will say that unfortunately I'm accepting this award for Friend in the Media at a pretty bittersweet moment, because I just recently found out that my column at Curbed has been permanently canceled after 8 years due to the consolidation of Curbed New York and New York Magazine. Local journalism in New York has really been slowly dying for decades. And I'd say the loss of so many of New York's historic buildings and small businesses goes hand in hand with the loss of its local news media outlets. There have been so many journalists over the years who've helped to document the history of the city, including inspirations to my own work like Jacob Riis and Joseph Mitchell. But today we have just a few publications left that are really covering the city in depth. And in an ideal world, there would be like dozens of journalists like me out there covering the streets of New York. But in reality, I don't really know of any other reporter at a major publication who has the same beat as me, which was wandering the entire city and reporting back about issues of preservation and gentrification and endangered landscapes and environmental justice. I think as the pandemic has helped to show us, New York is facing some really serious threats to its very existence. Alongside the terrible loss of life caused by the pandemic, we're already seeing countless small businesses close down right now due to its impacts, which is further emptying out our neighborhoods. There's some excellent journalism being done right now about this in New York City at Gothamist and the New York Times. And I recently wrote my first piece for Gothamist earlier in June, in which I looked at some of the historic businesses that have closed down due to the pandemic, including places like the Paris Cafe, which was in business for 147 years, Gem Spa, which was in business for 100 years, and the Irish Cottage, which was a 60-year-old neighborhood pub in Forest Hills. As this article notes, the years of high rents are now being combined with the uncertainty of the pandemic, which might cause anywhere from 30 to 40% of bars and restaurants around the city to be forced to close down. So how many more historic places might we lose just by the end of this year? The pandemic is, of course, just a precursor to what is coming our way with climate change. And much of my work as a journalist in recent years has been focused on what sea level rise and climate change might mean for the future of New York City. It's definitely not a pretty picture, I would say. A recent report by the New York City Panel on Climate Change predicted that the city is facing a sea level rise of between 1.25 and 9.5 feet by the end of the century, which is really just a catastrophic amount, I mean, in either case. Which leads me to, by my count, there's more than 100 neighborhoods along the coast of the city that could be wiped out by the end of the century by a sea level rise, which is just an unfathomable loss. There's already numerous neighborhoods along the coast of the city that are being flooded by the ocean every time there's a high tide. And 3 neighborhoods in Staten Island have already decided to retreat completely from the impacts of climate change, with the residents selling their homes to the state government and demolishing their houses permanently, with no one ever being allowed to live in these neighborhoods again. Which leads me to ask, what will historic preservation look like in the future in the face of climate change? What will we have to do to preserve some part of Lower Manhattan, or to preserve some aspect of Coney Island or the Rockaways, which could be completely underwater? How do you save a city that might be underwater? So if you believe, like I do, that New York City is one of the greatest cities in the world, I invite you to take a long, hard look at what's coming our way, and to think about what the city could look like in 50 years or 100 years or even 500 years. What's coming in the future is going to be one of the greatest challenges that New York has faced. And I believe that journalists and storytellers are going to be a crucial part of helping us to understand these challenges. So I'm going to conclude there and just wrap up by saying, let's see, did I turn off my screen sharing? Stop screen sharing. Oh, great. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying, again, thank you so much for this award. And it really is an honor to receive it. And I look forward to writing about many more years of good work from the Historic Districts Council. Also, I need to end with a special thank you to my wife, Sarah Nelson Wright. I call Sarah my secret editor because she's read the first draft of almost every one of my photo essays over the last decade, as well as collaborating with me on a ton of public art projects that look at the history of the city. None of this work would have been possible. I also want to say a brief thank you to our daughter Mira, also, who's only 1.5, but she's the only real New Yorker in our little family, the only one who was born in New York. So I look forward to showing her so many of these places that I've written about in the coming years as she grows up in New York City and experiences kind of these amazing pieces of history. And with that, I'll end and just say thanks again and turn it back over to the HDC.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Looking at all those places that have disappeared and all this and all the stories, I mean, only some of them only 6 years ago, 5 years ago, it's shocking. And we're incredibly grateful. We wish they were all still there, but we're incredibly grateful that you've made such a great record of them so that we can at least understand what has been lost. So that being said, and then we will also, we do have a question from the audience, which is, where is Hook Creek?
Hook Creek is really close to Meadowmere.
That's helpful.
Exactly. Hook Creek is at the very edge of New York City, beyond JFK Airport, at the head of Jamaica Bay. And it runs through these 2 or 3 New York City neighborhoods that are have been called like the land of the lost. They're just these super remote New York City neighborhoods that were not part of the New York City sewage system until, I think, like the 2000s. The city finally decided to hook them up to the sewage system. And it's this amazing creek that runs literally through, there's a ghost town of these abandoned buildings that were demolished in the marshland there. So you can kind of canoe out into this little creek and see these ruined buildings in the marsh. And that was a fun piece to write. I met New York City's only, or last remaining eel fisherman writing that piece. His name's Larry Seaman. And he's just an amazing repository of stories about the waterways of New York City. He lives on Hook Creek and still has a license to fish for eel and actually horseshoe crabs.
Okay, then. I'm not comfortable knowing that there is eel in New York City waterways, but that's beside the point.
Probably eating them too.
I'd now like to turn it over to Peter Bray.
Thank you, Simeon, and I want to extend a thanks to all the people who are participating in tonight's Zoom meeting, and say hello to you virtually. And I'm honored to participate in this program with Nathan this evening. And I'm also honored to have the Mickey Murphy award bestowed on me. I did not know Mickey personally, but I'm really happy that I've been able in a small way to follow in the legacy that she left for Brooklyn and for we're in New York. It's kind of coincidental that tonight marks the 1-year anniversary of my retirement. Simeon mentioned that I had been the executive director of the Brooklyn Heights Association, and that put a cap on over 40 years of my community development professional work. And what I want to talk about for the next 15, 20 minutes is the passion that I felt throughout those 40 plus years for preservation. And when I talk about preservation, I'm talking about really kind of the narrower preservation, which is historic preservation, which has always been so important to me, but also the way that historic preservation fits into what I consider to be a broader type of preservation, which is neighborhood preservation, and making sure that our cities continue to be a place that really reflects what I would generally call human aspirations, as opposed to being narrowly focused on commercial interests. So I want to talk a little bit about where I think that passion about preservation came from in my life. And I can't think of too many good things to say about this age of COVID-19, but one of the at least benefits for me has been being sheltering in place for so many months. It's given me an opportunity to spend a lot of time thinking about where this passion for preservation came from. So like Nathan, I wasn't born in New York City. I came from a transplanted Brooklyn family. I grew up in Lafayette, Indiana, which is a community of about 100,000, probably best known for the 45,000 students at Purdue University there. But growing up in the 1960s in Lafayette, it had this wonderful 19th century downtown. It had a real main street, and the center of the downtown was this incredible, enormous Second Empire County Courthouse. And as a child, I spent time in the downtown. That's where we shopped. That's where you went to see a parade. That's where my grandparents arrived by train from New York City. So I think that made a big impression upon me when I was a child. And as I got a little older, I developed a passion for photography. And I'm not going to show you any pictures tonight because none of them would compare favorably to Nathan's work. But I loved photography. I built a darkroom in the basement. And my recollection of those years in the later 60s was spending almost all of my free time wandering around the city, and in particular photographing the downtown. And Lafayette had these wonderful kind of gritty factories and industrial scenes. It was a big railroad town. And so when people would look at my work at that time, they'd say, no, that's interesting stuff, but how come there's no people in your photos? Well, there are no people in the photos because I think the thing that I really cared about was looking at the urban environment. So as a family, we would also make these annual pilgrimages to drive to New York City to visit our grandparents. And that was before the days of interstate. That was kind of torturous, making those long drives. But again, what left a strong impression upon me was my feelings about New York City and about Brooklyn in particular. To me, it was a magical place. All the buildings, the old architecture, and the ability to walk out the front door and walk down the street and find shops and restaurants and things there. And for a young child, that was an incredible sense of freedom. You didn't have to get in a car to go to the candy shop or to go to a bookstore. So one of the other things that made a big impact upon me was, you know, as we got into the later 60s, is that I saw the decline of Lafayette's downtown. And of course, this was a story that was being told all over the United States. A big shopping mall was built at the periphery of the city, and all the retail exited the downtown. And the downtown was left, the buildings were standing, but all the life of the city disappeared. And that was something that really disturbed me. I would say that the other thing that I think back upon that really kind of, I think, determined my course in life was I got to college and I thought I wanted to study one thing. And then 3 semesters later, I said, you know what, I'm not sure. And I began to study philosophy, and I wasn't quite ready yet to make a commitment in that direction. So I said, you know what, I've been in school for, I don't know, 17, 18 years, and I need some independence. I need to go out and see the world. I need to travel. I need to do something else. So I had a series of forgettable jobs, and I scraped together my savings, and I went off with a backpack to Europe. And my budget was $5 a day because, you know, I took seriously the guidebook, Europe on $5 a day. I said, well, I can do that. And, you know, I went off, and, you know, quickly I realized that after you've seen the 20th Cathedral and the 35th Museum, that you really need to find some other reason for what you're doing. And I think because of my interest in photography and because of this growing interest that I had in kind of the urban environment, that what I ended up doing was just simply wandering streets and small towns and the cities and just soaking up the ambiance of those places. The history, the fact that European cities preserve that history, the incredible texture of the street itself, the fact that the automobile was not a prominent part of those communities. And when I came home, I had what in my mind I'd call an epiphany. And the epiphany was, gee whiz, I loved looking at these cities. I loved thinking about the cities. Perhaps you can make a living doing work to revitalize our own communities. And from that point forward, my path in life was set. And that was really the launching point for my 40 years doing community development work. And all of that took place on a grassroots level. That was a level where I could see the impact of what I was doing. I felt that I could be most effective working on a grassroots level, and I never deviated from that, and I'm glad that I haven't. It's brought me a lot of joy over my career. And that career, I think because so much of it was involved with starting a project, doing the project, completing the project, the only drawback that was that when the project was done, you had worked yourself out of a job. So there were a lot of twists and turns to those 40 years. I was continually looking for, well, what's the next thing that's going to allow my passion to go into that type of work. When I graduated from college, I had a philosophy degree, but I knew that I wanted to do work in an urban area. And I went back to my hometown because my hometown was getting just at the start of a federal project to address the urban railroad conflict. There were railroad lines that trisected the city, and it was an opportune time for me. And one of the first things that I did there was to lease in a unused 1904 train station at the edge of the downtown. And shortly thereafter, I got a crew together, and this is while we had these periods where we were always waiting for the state to approve something or the federal government to approve something. This is during the whole environmental impact period that we had this kind of lengthy downtime, and we rehabilitated the train station, and we moved our project office in it. And I'd sit in my office, and there'd be a train that would go by my window 20 feet away. It was very exciting. But I knew I didn't want to stay in that community for my entire life. The project took 25 years to be completed. So I went off to graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, this fabulous opportunity came my way, which was to come to New York City, which is a place that I always wanted to live in, and to go to work in the South Bronx for a very unique local development corporation. This was in 1981. The city had been declared virtually bankrupt just a few years before. The city was falling apart. The South Bronx was falling apart. There were images of buildings burning. There was population loss. There was demolition taking place, but it was still a neighborhood in which 600,000 people were living. And even though that there were people in city government that said, let's let the South Bronx go entirely fallow so we can rebuild it. And that was really kind of morally indefensible. It was a place in which hundreds of thousands of people lived, and their lives were beset with crime and lack of heat and hot water and a roof over their head. So I went to work for the South Bronx Development Organization, and that was, for somebody interested in doing community development work in New York City, about the most exciting thing that I could think of doing. And my focus for the next 6 years was building the moderate income homeownership housing in the most devastated spot in the South Bronx. This was a 10-block area that was centered on Charlotte Street, and it was the area where Jimmy Carter came, President Reagan came, Bill Clinton came, and in those early years, it was viewed as being the national and international symbol of urban devastation. And so that was an enormously exciting period, was redeveloping that site. And again, going back to the concept of preservation, it was preservation by knitting a neighborhood back together. It was filling that land that had become vacant, that was filled with rubble, back with families and housing who would then send their kids to the local schools and restore life to that area. So when that project ended in the late 80s, I was at a crossroads, and I was a little burnt out by all the politics in the Bronx, dealing with the city. Makes interesting stories, but not tonight. And so I decided, you know, I really love doing preservation work. What I want to do is I want to move my career into adaptive reuse of historic buildings. And I got hired to be a construction manager, which was interesting because I really did not possess the knowledge or a lot of the skills to do that. But I guess in some ways I was a fast learner. And the project that meant the most to me was doing an interior restoration of a landmarked Broadway theater. And that took place at the very end of the 1980s. You might be familiar with the Hudson Theater on West 44th Street. But my timing wasn't all that great because at the end of the 1980s, the stock market crashed. And in some ways, it was good because construction came to a halt in New York City. But for me, it meant I was out of work. And that meant going back to the South Bronx, doing, again, neighborhood preservation work. And I spent the rest of the decade doing, not building new housing, but doing gut rehabilitation on abandoned 20 to 50 unit apartment buildings. And that morphed into building community facilities and then getting into some kind of economic development work. And then a fateful thing occurred. I discovered that in one of our buildings, we housed a low-income credit union. And I was fascinated with having a financial institution in our midst. And that led to, in 1999, founding a nonprofit organization that Simeon had mentioned. And for the next 15 years, I worked in an area that kind of grew up around a Clinton era program called the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. And I'm not going to go into all that, but it was a very difficult 15 years. The funding availability in that area changed and kind of went downhill over those 15 years. Support from the banking sector disappeared when the banks consolidated. Then 9/11 happened and the money flowed elsewhere. And then, of course, the housing crash in 2008, and the handwriting was on the wall. So around the end of the first decade of the 2000s, I said, you know what, we're not going to survive that much longer. I've got to look for a way of kind of transforming this organization and merging it into another organization, which I did. And Nathan had alluded to the fact that by that point, the city was changing tremendously. It was a Bloomberg era. What had been a concern in the 1980s for revitalization in New York City had now changed into a different type of economic development, which was really, let's open up the city for growth and development, and our neighborhoods were rezoned. And I think we all watched while our neighborhoods were torn apart. And I got angry and angrier as that period went on. And the only thing that kind of saved me was that I reached out to the Park Slope Civic Council and I asked, what can we do to protect other parts of Park Slope? How do we expand the historic district? And at that point, things were really just kind of getting started. The board was becoming more positive about the idea of supporting extending the landmarking. And so that became, as a volunteer outside running this organization full-time, building a committee and throwing myself into really basic historic preservation work. And the funny thing is that I honestly had no idea what I was doing when I first got started. You know, we did a survey of the neighborhood. I said, oh, wow, you know, with some others, there are about 4,000 buildings that could be added to the historic district. And then I learned the hard truth from the LPC. You got to be crazy. We're not going to do an extension with 4,000 buildings. And so we had to go back to basics. And fortunately, basics meant learning from the preservation community. And we were very fortunate that there was a Historic Districts Council, which gave us tremendous guidance during that era. And there was talking to other neighborhood associations. And Everett Ordner, who in some ways was the father of landmarking in Park Slope and the founder of a whole Back to the City Brownstone revival movement in the neighborhood still. And we talked to him. And gradually we kind of figured things out. And, you know, one of the things that we had to do was say, okay, where do we start with these 4,000 buildings? And one of the things that we had to do was to establish priorities. And that meant looking at two basic criteria. One was kind of who got short shrift back in the 70s that was left out. And that was kind of community politics with a small p. And that was really the south end of the neighborhood, which really didn't get much into the historic district at that time. And the other criteria we looked at was what part of the neighborhood was, and that was into the neighborhood that was next to Atlantic Yards. And that project was getting going. And the fear was that there would be a wholesale change in that part of the neighborhood. So that became our initial focus. And we were very fortunate that we got 2 extensions, one in 2012 of 600 buildings in the South Slope and 300 buildings in the North Slope in 2016. And then everything ground to a halt because it was the first term of the de Blasio administration. And without really naming names, the LPC didn't seem interested in doing a whole lot of landmarking. And so all the effort that we had poured into the next phases, which was about 1,500 buildings in the center slope, all the work that we did really fell upon deaf ears. And that kind of brings me up to where we are right now, because we're at a point where that work can begin again. There's new administration at the LPC. There's a greater willingness to do landmarking. Simeon, you can correct me, but I think that the city just designated the 150th historic district a few days ago. And HDC selected the Park Slope Civic Council to be one of its 2020 Six to Celebrate neighborhoods. So in my mind, the tide has turned, and this is going to be, I think, a very exciting years coming up, because I think the opportunity now exists to do much more landmarking in Park Slope. So I want to say that I'm very grateful for getting this honor, but I think that everybody who's listening today knows that to do preservation in New York City is not a solitary activity. It's an activity that requires a community, and I have been so fortunate to be part of this larger preservation community. And that community has played a role in every single stage of my preservation activity in New York, whether it was the neighborhood advocates in the South Bronx or HDC's help in getting us going in Park Slope, the association I've had with the Park Slope Civic Council for the last 15 years. And I want to give a special thanks to my neighbor, David Alquist, who has been kind of a co-chair of the preservation campaign in Park Slope from the very beginning. And I just want to say another couple words about HDC. I have such tremendous admiration for Simeon and all his staff. They are an unbelievably hardworking and dedicated group of people. And I want to include the board in that. And we really owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude, because so much of that preservation work, so much of those historic districts and individual landmarks would not have taken place without HDC's advocacy. So thank you so much for that. And I also want to add my thanks to all my colleagues in Brooklyn Heights that I worked with, particularly Judy Stanton and Otis and Nancy Pearsall. It was a great pleasure being there to cap off 50 years of preservation activity in Brooklyn Heights when 2 buildings on Montague Street were designated as historic landmarks. And I think that everybody knows that Brooklyn Heights was the first city historic district back in 1965, if my dates are correct. And also give a shout out to my colleagues at the Gowanus Landmarking Coalition. It's been a pleasure to work with all those people over the years. and you can count on the fact that I will continue to ask for help and seek encouragement from the wider preservation community here. So I mentioned that I retired a year ago. I retired with two goals. One was to do all the traveling that we had put off doing for so many years, my wife and I. And then, of course, this thing called a pandemic struck. So we're, kind of locked indoors. So that doesn't seem like much of an option. But the work on finishing what we started in Park Slope is my foremost goal. How I'm going to spend the next how many years. And I just want to end by asking everybody to join me in wishing HDC a very happy 50th anniversary. And we look forward to everything that HDC is going to do in the next 50 years. So thank you.
That's so very kind. Thank you so much, Peter and Nathan. We do have a few moments for questions. I have just one, because listening to both your stories is remarkable. I learned a lot and I remembered a lot. And isn't it, and the question I have to both of you is, there's a tendency to always imagine the past as this sort of lost time, that we didn't understand how good it was back when we had it. It's kind of ridiculous to imagine New York in 2004 to me to be a great time, but here we are. Where do you think? What do you can you sort of future cast? I mean, imagine 10 years from now, are we going to be like, oh yeah, remember the pandemic? That was a great time. We've lost so much since. I mean, where do we? How do you reverse engineer that? How do we make sure that we take the best advantage of the good times we're having now, if we're having good times now, which is questionable, but.
Well, if I can jump in, I think that there's an opportunity in every period. And I think it's because the preservation community always suffers losses. It's so easy to focus in on all the kind of negative factors out there. And undoubtedly, we will lose more fabulous buildings. But, I don't have a crystal ball, but I, read the paper avidly. And, the world's very different. Once this pandemic ends, whenever that is, we've all found that so many of us can work at home. It's going to mean that companies require less square footage to conduct their business. Who knows what's going to happen with the forecast for the city to add another 500,000 or 1 million population over the next 30 years. Perhaps that won't happen. Perhaps little of that will happen. Maybe we might even potentially lose population. So I think in some ways that these things create an opportunity for the preservation community to strike now and to put forth our platform. It is an election year, to put forth our platform and say, we're not going away. The city's going to be a different place. Maybe cramming hundreds or thousands of people in, 70-story high-rise apartment buildings really doesn't make sense in the era of COVID-19. And perhaps having the smaller scale that still exists in many parts of the city is really a much better way of dealing with public health. And who knows, maybe we'll take some of those office buildings that are going to go fallow, and we can convert some of them into affordable housing. I don't know, but it'd be very interesting to kind of reach out and have that conversation with the affordable housing community.
Nathan, any thoughts about, what we...
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I feel like the pandemic is definitely a terrible time for New York City, but also will certainly instigate some serious changes. and we're seeing that happen already, where, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're rethinking the history of some of the monuments around the city.
Mm-hmm.
We're rethinking the way that we interact with certain parts of the city government. And I think people are really looking at their lives and looking at how they live in New York City and thinking about, you know, what has the most meaning and value to them. I've already seen so many people really re-embracing kind of like getting to know parts of their neighborhoods that they might have not been able to see because they were going off to work every day. I mean, you know, people exploring natural areas in the city that they didn't have an opportunity to go visit, and now they're going there to socially distance. You know, for myself, it was the last 3 months have been really the first time I've actually seen like spring in New York City my entire life. It's the most spring I've ever seen. Watching trees bloom, watching nature really thriving in the absence of so many humans out there. So I think that, you know, we're going to go through some dark times with the pandemic. We're going through dark times now, but there will be some certainly catalyst for change there, which hopefully will be change for the positive. And I think we're starting to see that change towards the positive.
I hope so. I think so too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I saw someone raise their hand, but I don't know what
they
that
did.
means. Yeah.
That was Ann Friedman. But okay. That's, you know, I don't want to keep everybody. Here's something actually.
Do we think that Anne had an actual question? I could probably unmute her. She didn't put it in the chat. Or Anne, do you want to put it in the chat?
Meanwhile, let's talk specifics. Gowanus rezoning. Terrible idea or the worst idea?
He said it was an accident.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Gowanus is a neighborhood that I've been documenting the changes in for the last 17 years. So I have some pretty strong feelings about what has happened to the Gowanus and what is happening to the Gowanus in the future. For those who don't necessarily know, the Gowanus Canal is one of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States. It's a federal Superfund site in the heart of two, sandwiched between several residential neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And the city is proposing, and developers have already bought up all the land around it, with the idea that they will build residential buildings all along the banks of this canal and turn it into some kind of modern Venice. Personally, I question the wisdom of building anything, residential or otherwise, on the banks of such a toxic and polluted waterway that has not yet had its cleanup take place, and that will not really be cleaned by the federal government for like another decade or so, maybe 2 decades, who knows. It'll never fully be cleaned. But we're talking about building residential, we're talking about bringing thousands of people to live at the edge of like a super toxic area right as sea level rise is hitting the city. So you're going to have a new neighborhood flooded with some of the most toxic waters in the United States. I don't see the wisdom in that myself. I definitely don't think that the Gowanus should be developed in that way. I would love to see even more of the Gowanus's historic fabric preserved. There's so many amazing warehouses and structures there that still exist, that haven't been demolished yet, that could be preserved. But it was great to see that you know, there was a number of buildings there that were landmarked just recently, and like I did feel like that was a very positive thing to see industrial architecture considered seriously by the Landmarks Commission, and to see these buildings saved. That, you know, honestly, around the city you don't see a lot of great industrial buildings being landmarked. They're often overlooked, they're demolished, you know, they just disappear. So there is some hope that there has been preservation there. Maybe there could be more preservation.
And getting back to what you had said earlier, just about, you know, sort of a reconfiguring of the social capital of this, I think that it's now is the time to really look at what is the social capital that is going to be expended to build massive residential on an area that's toxic. Like, who is going to benefit from this? Particularly because it's right by these NYCHA houses that have been woefully underserved.
Yeah.
And, you know, Public Advocate Williams has been talking about trying to create some sort of process to sort of talk about social and racial and economic equity when you're doing a rezoning. And I just don't think that we should really necessarily put all these people at risk in order to make Jared Kushner more money.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, really, like looking at the bigger picture of the future of New York, there's so many projects that are being done around the city with the city government's approval, or even just the city government's direct support, that are putting thousands and thousands of people right into the same flood zones that were flooded during Hurricane Sandy, putting thousands and thousands of new units and apartments right into these areas that will probably be flooding in the future more and more frequently. So I wonder, like, I'm personally like, I don't think that we should be building anywhere that's a flood zone in New York City, and certainly not putting like tens of thousands of people at risk, because those are all so short-term projects, polishing the whole history of the waterfront, the industrial waterfront of the city, to make way for people to live for a very brief moment of time at the water's edge, because it's fashionable now to live at the water's edge. But I don't think that that's going to last. I mean, in 50 years, are those buildings still going to be, you know, tenable? What's it going to look like if your streets are flooded all the time?
Right. I mean, Sandy was not that long ago.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're facing this kind of situation where, you know, the short-term politics of the city's push to rezone that area. You know, my sense is that, you know, de Blasio wants to chalk up on his blackboard the number of affordable housing units he can lay claim to that went into the pipeline during his administration. And as you've said, not only in terms of the kind of environmental issues that exist down there, but when you think about sea level rise over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and that community is virtually at sea level, and has been subject to flooding from just ordinary rainstorms. And we had this massive downpour yesterday. And the first thing I thought to myself was, I bet that there was flooding in Gowanus. I didn't go down there to look, but so, you know, I think that we're just simply kicking the can down the road. And down the road, if we allow that rezoning to go through as it's been structured now, not only are we going to lose the unique character of the Gowanus community, but we're going to have a huge price to pay for addressing all these kind of environmental factors, not to mention the fact that that larger social equity issue of isn't it time that we address the plight of the NYCHA residents throughout New York City and find a way of making their lives better.
Definitely.
Yeah. I had a thought, it was gone, but yes. Let's see. SJ is writing in thank you, but yeah. Well, thank you both very, very much. I will let everyone sort of get back to their evenings. This has been a terrific presentation. Congratulations both. Looking forward to doing this again in person, you know, when we all can safely and happily do that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Do please keep in mind that part 2 of this is going to be on February 8th. I'm sorry, February 8th. Listen to me, July 8th. And also, if you are so moved, we are doing this for free, but it does cost money. So do please consider doing a suggested donation to HTC. You can find us on the HTC website, htc.org. And thank you all very much for spending your last evening of June with us. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Nathan, this is great.
Thank you so much.
Night, everyone.
Bye.